The etiquette at which people who consider themselves emancipated might smile because they had lost the intentions of the ideas which it symbolized was not formulated at a single stroke. It was the product of the experience of ages, the rational application of traditions, many of which reach back to the very founders of the dynasties, while some were even more ancient than the dynasty itself. France had had neither the privilege nor the special burden of etiquette. In it, etiquette was the law of the court, as it is the law of the court of every monarch by divine right. To make a joke of it, to ridicule it, to abolish it, give the popularity of a day, but overthrow a monarchy of 20 centuries, to act like Louis XVI shows the most complete misapprehension that a king can have, both of the character with which he's invested and of the conditions which allow him to exercise his power. The law of etiquette was not the invention of Louis XIV. He only adapted it to his kingdom by the instruction according to precedents of certain prescribed forms. But if the principle was differently carried out according to the usages of nations, it was virtually identical in Spain, in England, in all the Germanic monarchies, in Turkey, in Persia, in the Indies, in China, in Japan, in every place where a monarch reigns who claims to hold his power from God. The sovereign, by divine right, could only be approached by those of the nation who had been raised to the highest dignity. These are his witnesses and his servants. They assist at and take part in all the acts of his existence. They are the intermediaries between him and the nation, and render him services which, servile in themselves, take the character of the highest honors when his person is questioned. They are under obligation to render them, but it's also a right, and the sovereign cannot recede from it without falling short of his character. The two terms are inseparable. If it is a privilege to approach the sovereign, a privilege dearly bought, for in addition to the questions of birth and position, every place in France at least involves its money value, which is considerable, it's necessary that the duty of every post which gives this privilege should be performed personally by its occupier, and that regularly and punctually, whether important or otherwise, so that every courtier must consider himself infinitely honored by the office which he fills, by the fact that his duties compel him to be in the presence, and he must be so deeply devoted to the interests of the sovereign that he can imagine no other ambition than to serve him, nor conceive any other desire than to please him, nor form any other project than to advance his good graces. His faith in the monarchy must spread through every courtier to the public, so that every man who gets rich or who rises in the world shall not think himself satisfied until he has gained possession by his money or by his sword for himself or his descendants, some place in which he can personally serve the king. In order that each of the ceremonies which form the reason for the presence of each of the officers of the household may be duly performed, it is necessary that the life of the sovereign should be laid out to the minute, that the sovereign should never be wearied nor bored by being thus waited upon, that he should feel so deeply the inmost nature of his quasi-divine mission that none of these attentions should weary him, that he should bring to it the conviction that he is not performing vain ceremonies, but acts of a lofty importance. In this way, everyone is satisfied. From it, the king draws the power of faith in himself. For it, he is more respected, and this respect increases his importance in his own eyes. The officers of his household feel themselves honored in serving him, consider themselves the foremost members of the state, and if they give themselves up to the intrigues to obtain the favor of the sovereign, they are not dangerous to the throne. The nobility and the upper middle class aspire to offices which can be multiplied indefinitely and which are an inexhaustible resource for the treasury at the same time that they form the goal of all ambition. The very people, knowing that a sovereign is waited on by the most illustrious families of each province, for that reason acquire more veneration for the master of masters. For the existence of a hereditary monarchy, it must unite in itself these three elements. The sovereign must be convinced that he possesses in his own person the fullness of the law. Those who surround him must be convinced that as the sovereign is the embodiment of law, to approach him in order to render him the most humble services constitutes the highest distinction. His subjects, all his subjects, must be convinced that the sovereign could be no other person, that he is because he is, that he has had, so to speak, no beginning, So old is his dynasty, and that he will have no end. So surely is its heredity assured. Etiquette alone ensures these three elements by confining within the court the material life of the sovereign. It becomes surrounded with a sacred mystery. It is from this mystery that its power proceeds, and it is the reason why, little by little, except in the case of the very greatest, the absolute sovereign becomes unapproachable. His face can no longer be looked upon. Those even who are admitted to his presence must now lift their eyes towards him. Everything depends on this. It all hangs together. The Oriental despot who lives shut up in his harem, whom none of his subjects have ever seen, whose presence is only revealed to the ambassadors of foreign nations by the rhythm of traditional music or by the barbarous clang of brazen gongs, is alone logical. He is God's envoy, or he is God, and God is invisible in Europe because the dynasties are there too young, and probably for that reason alone kings have not driven logic quite so far, but they would have arrived at that point if they had lasted. In France, ceremonies had already acquired such an importance that they engrossed nearly all the hours of the day, and each was necessary. Not so much because tradition would have it so, but because the existence of the ceremony had caused the creation of a whole group of offices, which would not have been filled up if the king had got rid of it. When the revolution redeemed or abolished the offices, the ceremony fell into disuse. The tradition nevertheless remained. Was it really the sovereign? Unless he was surrounded by the same crowd, which in former times surrounded the king, unless the same ceremonies were performed, how, on the other hand, was it possible to have the courage to submit to them? How was it possible to have the endurance to support, day after day, such servitude? But was it possible to yield to that series of obligations which, up to the last days of the Bourbon monarch, a company, for example, so simple in act as the levee,